Gender and the Law, Matters Arising. This is the last episode of the first series. In today's session, we'll be looking at how the current COVID-19 outbreak has substantial implications for gender inequality and how to stall or alleviate these implications. We'll be touching on issues such as women's leadership in pandemic responses, COVID-19 and sexual and reproductive health, COVID-19 and gender-based violence. And to have this conversation today, I would like to introduce you to my panelists. So we have Professor Josephine Japa-Dewuni, Associate Professor, Howard University and founder, African Women in Law. Professor Akosua Adomako Ampofo, Professor of African and Gender Studies, University of Ghana. Nana Oyelita, former Minister for Gender, Children and Social Protection, Ghana. Mameya Mensah Bonsu-Barnes, convener, multidisciplinary Conference on Disability and Development, Lancaster University, Ghana. Bashiratu Kamal, Gender Equality Officer of the General Agricultural Workers Union, GAU of the Trades Union Congress, Ghana. So I would like to start with you, Professor Adomako. COVID-19 has amplified in a spectacular way persistent and structural issues of gender inequality. We know that many of the issues that have been exacerbated by the pandemic are not in any way novel. Are there any perspectives you would like to share in setting the stage for today's discussion about how socially constructed roles and identities can and have affected vulnerability to engendered experiences of the pandemic?
Thank you very much, Felicity, and good afternoon or good morning or good evening to everyone, depending on where you are. Yeah, that's a loaded one, and let me outline four things that I was thinking about. One is the social expectation that women will be responsible for reproductive and care work. I'll mention the four, and then depending on time, I'll go into a bit more detail. It's very much related to the expectation that women will be predominantly responsible for care work also when it comes to the management of the disease, so the health sector. The third area that has a major impact for women is the economic, so where women are working and how they are able to eke out a living. And the fourth area, I would say, is in the area of professionalism and expertise. The expectation that men are the experts when it comes to both the political, the medical, the social, and the other forms of interventions. And since I'm there, let me continue from that perspective. One of the areas where you see that very starkly is in the number of panels, conferences, pieces of scientific intervention that are being produced, where a majority of the responders or a majority of those who are invited to respond are men. This particular panel is probably an exception in many cases. So even the term manels has come up. It's not a new term, but has received a lot of significance at the moment, because you see all these panels that have mainly men on them. And so the message that is conveyed is that men are the experts on COVID. What that also means, beyond the symbolism of seeing many cases, that the knowledge that women have is often not recognized or is not sufficiently recognized in addressing the outcomes of COVID. Let me go back to the issues of reproductive work. So especially during the period of lockdown, but even as many states have opened or partially opened, most of the work that is done at home to support family members is being done by women. And the expectation is that women will do the cooking, women will do the cleaning, women will do the caring of children, of the elderly, that that need care, and that probably now need more care because children are not going to school. Perhaps those that you had to help take care of the elderly are not able to come because of COVID. They can't live with you or they live too far away. And so if there are women in the household, most or much of that work falls on them. It means, therefore, that if a woman is working from home, in addition to the work that she's doing for her employer, She's also preparing the meals, making sure that the children do their homework. If they're doing their work online, she's managing that. She's taking care of feeding in the home, or if they are elderly children in the home, it's often the daughters that are expected to do that. So it adds an extra layer of work, a triple or quadruple shift, but it also means that not only is the time expectation stretched often beyond limit, but it also means that there's a psychological drain, there's a mental drain, and there is a bit of initial research coming out showing that women are suffering more in terms of mental ill health as a result of what's going on. Related to that is the expectation, because there's this expectation that women will do all this work, where it is not being done or is not being done as well as is expected, it's often leads to arguments, quarrels, and in many cases, domestic violence. So there are also studies showing that rates of domestic violence are increasing, in some cases 4 times what used to be the case prior to that. Let me then move to the healthcare sector. Even though men are found to be, they seem to be at a higher risk, or the infection rates among men for COVID-19 seems to be higher, the frontline workers, especially at the lower levels where you're not dealing with medical specialists, tend to be women, the cleaners, the orderlies, those who are emptying the bedpans and so forth. Or the middle level, the junior medical officers. Very often these are women. And so there's an increasing burden on them, expectation that they will, rise to the occasion, make sure that they take care of everyone. If they don't, people look at them as scams. This is your job. Why are you not doing it? And if you think that these frontline healthcare workers, even those who are providing the food in the kitchens, also then have to go home and take care of their own families, and are also burdened with the anxieties. What if I get COVID-19? What will happen to my elderly parents? What will happen to my children? So, the layers of expectations on women, very much related to social reproduction, extremely high. And the final one that I have mentioned earlier was the economic aspect. So because more women than men tend to be working in the so-called informal economy, and much of that work has declined. And yet, at the same time, women are expected, in our African context, you are looking after your family. The lineage system means that your family is not just your children, your spouse, your parents, but also siblings and other elderly relatives. The minute you lose your income or part of your income, it puts you in a very vulnerable position, because then you become dependent on other people. It is associated with issues of violence. It's associated with, you're not being a good daughter, you're not a good daughter-in-law, what's going on. So, obviously the research is still ongoing for us to understand the gendered implications, but I think that this is how I can map it out in general.
Professor Dawini, would you like to make any comments on that?
Yeah, so Professor Adumaku, thanks for setting the tone for this discussion. I must begin my statement remarks by saying that, commending the School of Law for the 7-part series and for the wonderful work done. So when a good thing is done, we have to say it. And I also want to commend them for having a panel on gender issues, laws, matters arising. However, there is a but. When I first got the invitation and the preliminary panel showed there was a gentleman on the panel, and I was excited about that. But the final panel, as you can see, it's all women. It's a different perspective, depending on where you stand. And some would say, well, as Professor Adumaku said, we've had manuals. There's been a push, there's always, the push is ongoing against these manuals, men as the experts, the knowers. On the other hand, if you look at it, if we are talking amongst ourselves as women, as gender activists or feminists, whatever classification you call it, then the battle will be half won. So I just want to put it on the table that the gendered construction, the roles that women are often burdened with, the care work and the psychological impact it has on them, the economic ramifications, as Professor Adomako has talked about. We also need to do a job of undoing these gender constructs that say that only women can talk about women's issues. For some people, it's a good thing. Well, we should talk about our lived experiences, which is true. But we also need to know that that is also us putting an extra burden on ourselves, having to be the experts in this area. There are many men, as you know, who are feminist minded, women's rights minded, and we need to bring them to the table to have these discussions. So that's one point I want to make, that ungendering gender, it's my thing, that we need to deconstruct the word gender itself. As you all know, gender is a social construct, cultural, political, economic construct. So if we're looking at undoing gender in order to move forward, we have to look at the fact that men are also part of these constructs, and they should be part of deconstructing those constructs. So my first point in response is we have to engage in ungendering gender and know that gender is not synonymous with women. The second point I want to make in response is the idea of decolonizing gender. We know that there's a lot going on about decolonization in African systems generally. And we also have to go back to the African systems of gender constructs that existed pre-colonial and see how we can decolonize these conceptions of gender. Lastly, in the spirit of decolonizing gender, I want to mention the issue of African gender activism. We have a long history of women fighting the forefront against colonial administrations, against military dictatorships, and we need to bring that African feminist grassroots activism in the fight against COVID-19 and all other issues that women face. So those are the points I would make, and I would end here.
Okay, the pandemic has caught many governments and policymakers off guard. We've seen a range of measures, including stimulus measures, adopted across the world. In developing countries, the point has been made that unlike their counterparts in the West, governments do not have the resources and policy breadth to adequately respond to the crisis. Nanoye, as a former cabinet minister, would you be in a position to share some perspective on what some of the structural difficulties that could impede how African countries adequately respond to the problem? What are we working with?
Yeah, thank you very much. I recall sometime in February, I was with a friend in one of the hotels, and she was from New York. We met another friend, and she refused to shake his hands because she was like, there's COVID. At that time, we didn't have a single case in Ghana. Then by March, 12th of March, we had 2 cases. Today, we have 10,358 cases. There was no provision in our budget. We didn't have a clue that this is where we would be, even at the beginning of the year. What did government do? Our Minister of Finance made a statement to Parliament. There were projections about the reduction of GDP. A committee was established to address the health needs. But then let's look at the challenges that a typical developing country like Ghana faced. So 1, a stimulus package has been announced by government. We have a 6-month or a moratorium for key industries. We also have commercial banks coming together to promote and grant some facilities, and a coronavirus alleviation program. How does it get to our women who are in the labor force? How do these interventions benefit our women particularly? What measures have been put in place to ensure that they benefit? For women in the labor force, and we have over 64% of the labor force in Ghana being women, these measures that governments have put in place, do they act as safety nets? How are they cushioned? The tax moratorium, what does it mean for the market woman in Medina or the market woman in Malata? Is she aware that there's a tax moratorium. When you look at the labor statistics of Ghana, most women are in agriculture, they're in wholesale and retail, the hospitality industry. Ministry of Finance is telling us that the hospitality industry is the worst in terms of the adverse impact of COVID. So how are we making sure that the labor force, the women there, are able to benefit and are targeted? So that is one critical difficulty, the arrangements that government has made. Then in terms of access to humanitarian interventions, in terms of who is most vulnerable, who should be targeted for relief, for the safety nets, for dry food, who should be targeted. So we don't have a household registry, which will help government target those most in need. And that is one difficulty that is right across, not only in Ghana, but other African countries. Then we have an inadequate emergency crisis response mechanism for infectious diseases. We have for natural disaster, so we have an institution, NADMO, but then we don't have a national holistic response to address infectious diseases. So when COVID-19 came, we had a problem. We were able to adequately look at the health response, but then the socio-economic impact, we had huge challenges with that. We also, in terms of difficulties, we don't have an intra-government coordinating mechanism at all levels of governance, at the national, at the regional, and also at the district level to address some of these issues. So an intra mechanism that involves health, national security, interior security, and then NADMO and finance, and then also the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Protection. We have civil society groups and philanthropists supporting, but it was not coordinated because we don't have a mechanism to coordinate all that. What are we working with? We were not even sure about which government institution was best suited to even distribute humanitarian relief. So some said local government, others said the Department of Social Welfare, others said civil society, others said traditional authorities. So these were some of the difficulties. But somehow, at least we came up with a health committee that was responding. And then we also had the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Protection leading the humanitarian response, and civil society also doing what they also could do. But then it was fraught with difficulties, and there's a need for us as a country to look at all these difficulties and fashion out appropriate interventions that would address infectious diseases and some of these pandemics as and when they occur.
In Ghana, we saw the government adopt a series of measures, including the adoption of legislations, stimulus policies, lockdown measures, etc. Some have called into question the appropriateness of these measures, while others have lauded the decisiveness of the governmental response. To what extent were these responses gender sensitive? Do we see a conscious attempt to address the gendered impacts of the pandemic from a policy perspective? What was missing? Bashira, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Felicity. And I'm happy that a lot of justice has been done to the issue of gender gaps and the gender biases within the COVID response, and also within bringing out preventive measures. But I would like to say that even though this COVID-19 affects everybody, like all categories of people, including men and women and other people, the effect on women and other vulnerable people is very high. Talking about decent work deficits for them, talking about the lack of representation, even in terms of looking at policy programming and interventions, and also looking at gender-based violence, how it is upsurging. and also the impact of technology, how technology has affected some people. One of the panelists did mention the agricultural sector, which is an interesting sector. That's a sector that we represent workers in. And in this sector, some of the measures would not even benefit the workers because it cannot even be instituted in the first place. Now, looking at the legislations, there was the Imposition Act. I would have thought that the already existing provisions that we had in the Constitution and in other laws and policies, this was the time for us to ensure proper implementation of those policies and legislations. For example, before the lockdown, there was a closure of schools, which is one of the most important points for working women and career women, and even other women in the informal sector. Unfortunately, Article 27, as we know in our Constitution, has not been fully implemented. That is the provision of childcare facilities for working women. And women themselves had to take up the initiative of taking their children to crèche as they work. Unfortunately, during the closure of schools, this affected women negatively. Now, if we look at the issue of provision of stimulus package, what are the conditions attached to the who benefits? What is the criteria? Is it about size? Is it about vulnerabilities? Are women in the informal sector going to benefit equally? Are there some special provisions for vulnerable people? And one of the things I keep saying is that I would have expected that for you to access the stimulus package, there should be a condition. And the condition should have included that if you access it, then you are not going to do any redundancy or termination of employment of anyone of the sort. Unfortunately, that has not happened. And we are still waiting to see how businesses who benefit from this stimulus packages turn out to be, especially with their employees. Now, looking at the lockdown measures, that is where most of the issues are. After the lockdown, what happened? Before the lockdown, when schools closed, most women working in the formal sector especially had to take their leave days to be at home with their children. Unfortunately, we all know that the Labour Act provides for a minimum of 15 working days as leave. And after the closure of schools for 2 weeks, that is 10 working days, people had mostly 5 working days left. Now, into the lockdown, most employers, about 90% of employers, actually used the leave days of workers to count for the partial lockdown. So they wouldn't have to bear that cost. So that cost was borne by workers. So you take your leave days and go. Most of these women had already either exhausted their leave days or only had 5 working days leave left, just using the minimum in the Labour Act. Now, after the exhaustion of the 5 days, people were left to either take a leave of absence that does not earn you any income at all. And we all felt the brunt on social media where most people, especially teachers, were talking about termination of employment immediately when the partial lockdown was instituted, and also immediately when schools were closed. So these people are having to face an issue of income security and also job security, and they do not even know when all this is going to be over for them. And there's also the issue of introduction of new methods of working during the lockdown. We are looking at shift systems. We are looking at people having to work from home, flexible working hours, and Professor Akosia did justice to that, what the burden it brings on women, especially when they are working from home. We are looking at people having to go through a trauma of their appointments being terminated. And even here, the discrepancy has been whether people's appointments were to be terminated or there is supposed to be a redundancy. But in most cases, for unionized workers, the story was different because you cannot ask workers to go home without the involvement of the union to sit down and agree on the terms that on which workers are going to go home. For the leave case, for instance, within the unions, we have a collective agreement that gives workers, and when they exhaust their leave days, that gives them a compassionate or casual leave. So if I exhaust my leave, I could count on the compassionate leave from my employer or the casual leave from my employer to still be able to earn a certain level of income for myself. Now, if you look at the issue of shift system, there are some sectors that it does not work for at all, like the agri sector. I'm looking at the plantation side, where mostly workers who are doing pollination and pruning and weeding and other forms are going to work very early, maybe 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. And there is an occupational safety and health hazard that we also make sure that workers are protected from. So if you run a shift system, mostly when they go from morning to around 1 p.m., they leave because of the sun. We do not want a situation where workers are in the field working under the scorching sun. Now, how do you run a shift system for people to come up to 1 and another batch to come from maybe 1:30 or say 2 p.m. to a certain time? And there's also an issue of, could people even work in the evening? No. In the agricultural sector, for pollinators and other categories of workers, is it possible for them to even have the flexibility to work from home? That is not possible, because you cannot sit behind your computer and ask the computer to go and read for you. It's not going to work. And one other issue that came out even for pregnant and breastfeeding mothers had to do with the issue of shift system, even in other organizations that are not in the agricultural sector. And we know that the Labor Act protects against pregnant women doing certain type of shifts in the evenings. But unfortunately, some of the pregnant women reported that they were being asked to come to work at a certain time, which ate into the time in the evening, which was also very unfortunate. And breastfeeding mothers were also having to bear the brunt of leaving their children at home at a certain time and coming at a certain time. But someone will say that you can't blame employers much for it. But also there's a provision for a change of task. What happened to that? Could we have fallen on that to ensure that more women are protected, even though we are affected? And also, one thing that has led to most of these gaps within the sector has been the issue of fishing, the new forms of employment, where people even work and they don't know who their real employers is, the real employers are. So you work for a company and you want to even engage with the employer. The company is not your employer. You have to look for about 2-3 different people. And these people are working and they did not even have job security in the first place. So the COVID-19 compounded all the issues that workers had been facing prior to its emergence.
Mamia, do you have any comments to make?
Yes, so I come from an intersectional perspective, and I like to look at it from the issues arising from the intersection between gender and disabilities. So we've talked about how women have suffered disproportionately the effects of the pandemic, but we haven't looked at women with disabilities, for example, or the caregivers of children with disabilities. And as Professor Akosua mentioned, caregiving is usually, in our context, on the burden of the mother, of the woman, or the female in the house. Now, if you're looking at the stimulus packages, the taxation, the frontline workers, there's so many questions that come up when you think about it in the context of disabilities. So, for example, women who have children with disabilities at home. Now, when schools were open, it was an opportunity for you to be able to do some work while your child is being cared for by other people and with professionals with therapy care and all of these things. Now they have to stay at home. So the mother not only becomes the teacher if the child is able to go through standard educational processes, but also a therapist. She has her work to do and all the other things that women would do traditionally in that setup would then be compounded by the fact that now there's a child with disability as well. And that wasn't accounted for in any of the policies that I have seen so far. It doesn't even lessen the burden when the woman also has a disability, because the research shows that women with disabilities still have caregiving burden. So not only is she having to do all the things that she would have done without COVID and the lockdown and all that stuff, but now she's a therapist, she's a caregiver, she's a counselor. She has so many roles, all of which impact on her ability to earn an economic, to eke a living, at least according to standards she used to have. Are the policies recognizing the challenges that, say, for example, caregivers with disabilities, of children with disabilities have? And women with disabilities are disproportionately, even amongst women, they have challenges there also. So when fashioning out policies or legislation, there's, even for women, there's got to be an extra element that we look out for, the disability element in there. So we talked about leave. If you've exhausted your leave and you have dependents with disability who are more vulnerable, who are more susceptible to illnesses, you tend to have to take a lot of leave, generally speaking, even when there's no challenge. So if you've already exhausted it and you have a child with disabilities and you have to take care of the child and the child is sick, that eats further into any other leave allowances that you may have. Now, however generous your employer, COVID has hit everybody. So people are going to start cutting back what they used to do so that they can hold on to some profit. But our policies are not embracing this idea. And it's strange for me because they are the people with disabilities are the largest minority. You cannot legislate or create policies without considering the effect on people with disabilities. So when we talk of the lockdown and something that we mentioned in the disability circles, they say don't touch your face, right? And keep a distance of 2 meters or something from people who are deafblind. They communicate by touch. There isn't any other way a deaf-blind person can communicate but by touch. So necessarily they should be in a special category of protection because they can't afford to distance themselves. How will they communicate? How will they understand what's going on? So what other people can take for granted, if you have a child with disabilities who was deaf-blind, you necessarily must touch the child. If you yourself are deaf-blind, you need someone to keep touching you to be able to communicate information to you about COVID, for example. So there are many barriers to communication for people with disabilities. And one of the things that I was hoping to see is an emphasis on that group of people because they are a large minority and they have so many variables that they have to contend with that perhaps other women and other people don't have. So one, you have that they have, and then also they are more vulnerable to COVID. One, like I said, because they can't really socially distance in some cases. And also because if you're thinking about underlying comorbidities, then many of them are in that endangered category. Are there any policies that are dealing with that category of people specifically? None that I have seen so far. So even in terms of the stimulus packages, the legislation, we are leaving out this significant group of people. So if you say stimulus packages, and as has been mentioned before, women dominate the informal sector. To get into these stimulus packages, you must have a registered this, you must fill out that, you must deal with this. How is that information getting to people who need that extra level of attention, who need that extra communication? So if we can't find, if we can't get to them, then yes, there's a significant gap in our policy and legislation. And we need to start talking about that as well.
In many countries, including the UK, for instance, calls to a domestic violence line during the lockdown went up by 65%. Gender-based violence has become a global trend, which is being referred to as the shadow pandemic. We know, for instance, that for many people, the lockdowns meant that they were forced to shelter in places where there were abusers. In Ghana, are we seeing similar trends? Are we in a position to gather data on the full extent of the problem? And from a policy standpoint, how do we address these spikes in gender-based violence? Professor Dawuni, can you please go first? Sorry.
Yeah, so without repeating what you said and what the research has shown, evidence coming out has shown that domestic violence and other forms of gender-based violence, not just domestic violence, have increased in light of COVID-19. And rightly so, as the United Nations Women has said, it's a shadow pandemic. But some would say it's a long pandemic that has been in existence for many years. Women activists have been talking about it. Women researchers and others have written about it. And so in some way, it's unfortunate that the numbers are increasing. But if there's anything to be taken out of the COVID-19 pandemic, is that this, I'll call it a storm, that this storm of COVID-19 and the gender-based violence that has increased as a result of it, that this storm would hopefully lead to some light, some rainbow at the end. That these discussions, or all the discussions at the national level, global level that we are having about gender-based violence will not be something that we'll forget, hopefully after this pandemic passes, when it does pass. but that it would help us to begin to think about innovative ways of addressing this issue, so that in the next couple of years, we are not going to be reactionary when there's something else happening. Hopefully that nothing happens, but the world systems has a way of throwing curveballs at us, that we will not be reactionary, but that would have put in place the systems to address these issues. And so what does that mean? With the start of the pandemic, when it really got global with the World Health Organization's declaration of a pandemic, the Institute for African Women in Law instituted a blog series, which we called Women, Law and Justice, the Feminine Face of COVID-19. So the call asks people to write from different perspectives, especially locating women or centering women, and looking at how COVID-19 is affecting women within the African continent. And I was initially interested in hearing from the ground what was going on in different countries across the continent. After a while, I was getting to the point of getting depressed, because almost all the entries I were receiving were on gender-based violence. And having to read and edit these over and over again told me that really there was something very wrong going on. And so what does this mean? As researchers and as social scientists and even scientists, we have to always go back to the data. It is a fact that the United Nations Women, the World Bank, and other non-governmental organizations have done research, collected data to show us the increase in trends. But when you come to the African context, we have to be mindful that when we're collecting data, or we are going on with these discussions that are happening at a global level, that we are also looking at it from an African-centered perspective. Domestic violence, like I said, gender-based violence, like I said, is not new in the African context or the Ghanaian context, unfortunately. There's been a lot of research done to show the numbers, to show the determinants. We know that these determinants are economic, they are political, they are sociocultural, religious, you name it. And we also know that these determinants do not fear class. So it's not just the poor woman, rural woman who faces gender-based violence. Educated women, highly educated, highly social placed women also face forms of violence. And it's not only physical, it's all, it manifests itself sociological and all that. So as we're talking about gender-based violence, we also have to be mindful that it's not just a woman issue. Women, or we have to look at it from the perspective of the girl child as well. And I always say that the girl of today is a woman of tomorrow. So how the girl is socialized, the effects of societal constraints on her would definitely have an impact on how she sees and analyzes information when she becomes a woman. So we have to be mindful of what the girls are also going through and try to deal with it. Evidence has shown that in times of crisis, whether the Ebola in Sierra Leone, Liberia, DRC, that girls did face a lot after the crisis kind of passed in terms of being out of school and getting pregnant and so with all of these, what do we do about it? The solutions are many. We've talked about these, but we also have to be mindful that in dealing with these solutions, we are also involving men in the discussion. If most of the perpetrators, and I say most, are men, then they have to be at the discussion table when we're talking about these determinant factors. We have to get them involved in other ways. From the legal perspective, institutions, such as the judiciary, would also have to make sure that there are specific provisions during the lockdowns, the urgent cases that calls for hearing, that specific provision is made for hearing cases that affect women in terms of gender-based violence. Politically, the government has a role to play. And by government, not just those in elected office, all of us are part of the government, that we must have women at the table when we are having discussions. I started off saying that women should be part of the solution in discussions like this. Women also have to be part of the policy making process. We have to be part of the assessment making. We have to be part of the assessment after the policies have been implemented. So governments must heed to their duty of providing the necessary resources to address these issues.
Okay.
And one of the big issues, as we know.
Hello. Okay, no, thank you very much, Professor Dawuni. Naloli, can you speak on, are we in a position to gather data on the full extent of the problem in terms of gender-based violence? And from a policy standpoint, how do we address these spikes in gender-based violence?
I believe we're in a position to gather data because across the country, we have the Domestic Violence and Victim Support Unit that is part of the Ghana Police Service. We also have the DOFSU Secretariat, that is a department under the Ministry of Gender, Children, and Social Protection. So we are in a position to gather data, but then there's a need for those institutions to put that mechanism in place to enable us gather data, because I was trying hard to collect some data for this program, and it was quite difficult. So I don't know how many cases have arisen or have been reported that are COVID-19 specific. And I wouldn't be able to say the percentage of the spike and what the increase is. And I'm hoping that the Domestic Violence and Victim Support Unit would be able to help us with data. I know, however, that the Domestic Violence and Victim Support Unit, together with UNFPA, right at the start of COVID, did something very innovative and interesting. They put out a number. They did a lot of awareness creation, and they did a lot of work on encouraging survivors and victims to report cases of gender-based violence and domestic violence. So that was, a lot of work was done. It was all over social media, and people who had suffered were encouraged to report, and they're still doing a lot of work on that. I also know that the judiciary put out arrangements for court cases, what sort of court cases can be heard, because we know that there are issues with maintenance of children. Now the children are at home. There are issues with custody, that you had cases where parents had been granted custody, and then because of COVID, there were problems and issues with the parent who has access, being able to access the children. So certain arrangements were made. I also know that DOFSU was open as usual. There was no change in their opening hours. So then anybody who suffered gender-based violence was able to go and report to the police. And actually, 2 weeks ago, I helped somebody to report a domestic violence case in Adenta and also in Medina DOFSU. So they were opened all the time. And that really helped. But I wish that there were more specific arrangements to further protect women. And we had quite a number of cases of rape being reported in the media. And there was even one reporter who talked about fears that with the close down of schools as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, it would lead to a spike in incidents. We also had certain cases of child marriages also being reported. Now that the children were at home, there was also the vulnerability of children who, girl children who were also being given up for marriage. And then we even had a case of trafficking, I think a week or two ago. So all these cases have come up. So we obviously have a complication of these cases that even in COVID, we have an exacerbation of cases and an increase in vulnerabilities of girls who are given up for marriage, of girls who are raped, and then also children who are trafficked. So the COVID situation has actually enhanced and increased vulnerabilities in terms of gender-based violence.
Thank you, Nanoye. Mamiya, as we're aware, the Domestic Violence Act was passed in 2007. One of the measures the Act envisaged was the creation of a domestic violence fund, which was supposed to provide basic material support for victims of domestic violence. What are some of the challenges that have impeded the full implementation of the law, and in particular, stalled the institution of the fund? To what extent are existing laws pandemic appropriate? Has it been in need for revision?
This is a huge question, a three-part question, so I'll take them in bits. And I think I'll take the existing law part first, because that is an area that really concerns me. And I've been talking about how, if you look at our Domestic Violence Act, for me, the penalties there are insufficient, they're inadequate. And I speak from a purely theoretical, legal theory perspective, that if you're going to express censure at something, if you take the time as a polity to legislate separately, because the offenses there could very well go under Act 29, under assault, under murder, under rape. But if you take the time to legislate a special provision, a special act to deal with domestic violence, you are saying something about what the state views, how the state views domestic violence. So the punishments there should be appropriate to how the degree of censure that we are, and revulsion that we are expressing, towards this pandemic. Now, as it stands now, the most serious penalties is 3 years or something like that. I find it really inadequate to deal with what we had even before. And now with the surge, given the different ways in which domestic violence can occur, I think that we should start to think about how do we deal with these things, particularly when it has to do with financial abuse, emotional abuse. Those ones are far more difficult for people to deal with, and for even the authorities to work with. So there should be some, in terms of going forward, we need to read domestic violence generally, because the act was a good start to recognizing other forms of abuse. But thereafter, there seems to be this idea that, maybe Nana, you would correct me if I'm wrong, but there's from all the interactions I've had with DOF, so there's a concern about maintaining the marriage and keeping the family unit together. And while this is a good thing, this is a laudable, my apologies, while this is a laudable provision, I mean, starting point, some things should not be saved, some things should just not be protected. So even the way where we began, where the things that underpin the act indicate the direction in which the act is going to take. And that is why we have such weak enforcement mechanisms. In terms of the fund, some of it is just political will. And in many cases, things that have to do with women, I'm careful so that Japa doesn't accuse me of conflating gender with women. But in many cases, things that have to do with women take the back seat. We are dealing with economics, look at how quickly the COVID fund was set up and how we're quickly donating things. It always takes a back seat. Even the way we refer to it as a shadow pandemic, it's on the back burner consistently. So some of it is the social awareness of the importance of putting this at the front. There should come, we should come to the point where we say, this is so important that the fund must set up now. And I don't think that we are doing that right now. The third part of the question, I forget now. But again, in terms of domestic violence, particularly for, again, my interest being in disabilities, the existing law does not deal with that, does not mention it at all. And I think it should be punished differently, completely differently, because that's a whole level of abuse that women with disabilities have had abuse in a way that other women do not. So our laws should recognize that disparity in treatment. And at this point, they don't do that right now. And a number of people have been calling for a revision of the existing legal framework, so that we don't have to keep going under Act 29, which is the Criminal Offences Act. We don't have to keep going under Act 29 if you want a stiffer penalty. The DV Act, that's what it's meant for. It should be able to operate on its own without having to keep seeing, should we punish him more and then go under the main legislation. And if that happens, for me, it's an inadequate piece of legislation.
I know you have your hand up. You can come in.
Yeah, thank you very much. About the domestic violence fund, that has been problematic for quite a while. And the basic challenge has been the resources. The fund was set up pursuant to the law, the 2007 law, but no dedicated funds. So there was nothing in the budget to say that, okay, we give this amount of money from this source to the domestic violence fund. And so it's been funded on ad hoc basis, where you have one minister or the other raising funds from out to actually put in that fund. And so I recall that as a minister, we didn't even get more than 10,000 Ghana cedis for the fund. And we used it for one domestic violence survivor from our foundation, and then also to support the Sexual Assault Center of the Department of Children of the Kolibu Teaching Hospital. So that has been a problem. And there's a need. I would recommend that our budget should stipulate a dedicated source of funding, maybe a percentage of the funding being given to the ministry for the domestic violence fund. Without the resources, it will be very difficult for the government to support survivors of domestic violence. We also have a serious challenge with payment of medical bills by people who report gender-based violence. So the law is very clear that medical treatment or access to healthcare for victims of gender-based violence under the Act is free. And there's been this debate. And what is happening is that it is adversely affecting the ability of the prosecutors, the investigators to actually prosecute. So when you analyze the data from the Domestic Violence and Victim Support Unit, you find out that we have a very low conviction rate. And you have a lot of cases under investigation, over 70%. And this brings in its wake high levels of impunity. So I'm not surprised that we're seeing an increase in rape cases. And there's a need for us to address that, how we're going to enforce that aspect of the Act, that when I'm raped and I go to hospital, I do not pay hospital bills. And we also need to also address the forensics, scale up the forensics so that our prosecutors and investigators can also increase their levels of conviction. So these are some of the challenges. And of course, COVID raises up these challenges very much.
Thank you, Nanoye. Professor Dawini, what are some of the peculiar issues the pandemic has raised in regard to sexual rights and sexual health and reproductive rights?
Yeah, so before I come to that, I just want to add on very quickly to what Mami and Nanoye said regarding gender-based violence. All the issues, the challenges you've enumerated are very, very clear. And I want to add the issue of coming back to the political will or the lack of it. Shelters are very important, which is part of the provision that should have been made under the Act. But to the best of my knowledge, apart from the Act Foundation that has really done its, kept a shelter as a non-profit, non-governmental organization, there's no government shelter center. And I could be corrected if I'm wrong. And so there has to be that, because if you don't take a person away from the place where the violence is occurring and they don't have any other means of escaping, then you are leaving them to face more violence. So shelters have to be important. And so for that reason, I will advocate that we make it a political issue. That when there are elections coming up, which we're having one soon, members of parliament are running for office, the president, that it should be on the agenda at the national level so that we can hold these people accountable, members of parliament accountable. Because if the government or parliament is responsible for the budget, then if they are in parliament and they don't advocate for giving money for the ministry to be able to enforce these mechanisms under the Act, then where do we go? So going into the issue of sexual and reproductive rights, I want to make it clear that when we talk about sexual and reproductive rights, it's not about abortion. Most people start off thinking, oh, they need money for abortion. It's not. Abortions, as we know under the law, may be justified for some reasons. I'm not going to go into the merits. But beyond abortion, we also have to think about the fact that sexual and reproductive rights is about the woman's body. So with COVID-19, how has that been affected? We know that hospitals are having to triage their provision of services, and even complicated by the fact that if you go to the hospital, some people are fearing to go to hospitals or health centers because it might be affected there than being affected at home. So how do we deal with it under COVID-19? That we go back to the fundamental law of Ghana, the 1992 Constitution, which grants women access and equal access to health and other means. We also can draw from the regional level, the Maputo Protocol, which is a women's rights protocol in Africa, which has specific provisions for provision of health and also for governments to prevent or avoid practices that would be detrimental to women's health. And then, of course, we can go to the international level and look at the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which also makes for women's health. So what should we do in the COVID-19? That women's health should equally be prioritized. Going back to Mamia's point, we have to remember that women come in different categories. Women with a disability also need health care and reproductive care. So we should make sure that we have available centers that would continue with the annual screening that women need, that pre and postnatal care is provided for women during pregnancy and during delivery and after delivery. We haven't yet had scientific evidence to show how COVID-19 or the coronavirus affects the unborn child, but that is also something that needs to be looked at in terms of how do we protect unborn children and children who are born in the hospitals and their mothers from getting infected during this time of COVID-19. So all of these should be prioritized because women are at a higher risk of getting infected if they go through healthcare centers for prenatal and postnatal care.
Thank you. Mamia, would you like to come in? You had your hand up.
Yes, I wanted to just highlight the fact that, I mean, at this time that movement is very limited and people are encouraged to stay at home, there's an increased urgency for the domestic violence issues to be addressed because one of the biggest challenges to the investigation that Nanoye mentioned is even reporting. So even when we could get away from the people who are abusers, we didn't want to report. Now that we have to stay with them even more than before, reporting is definitely going to be a bigger issue than we had before. So what Professor Japa talked about, the shelters, but those things are really important because if you're going to go back home to your abuser, you have to have somewhere to go away from that space. And that will encourage more people to, I think if we had those things, we'd have a far higher number of reports than we do right now. And also, again, this should please you, Japa, that there are men who are abused at home who, for obvious reasons of stigma and they have to maintain this facade of being the boss of the house. They can't report these things. And the DV Act needs to take a look at that angle as well and to start talking about the other dimensions to domestic violence, even though it's hands down, women suffer it far more. There's still a growing number of males who have to deal with that, and we should start working on that angle as well.
Hello, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Very quickly, it's about reproductive health care, especially for young women. There are certain traditional channels, for instance, for supply of contraceptives. So how has the post-lockdown and COVID-19 affected those traditional channels? Are young women and men able to access the contraceptives? Because if we have a reduction or if we have a cutting of those supplies, it's going to result in teenage pregnancy and it's going to result in an increase in sexually transmitted infections. So these are all issues that our health service needs to look at. These are issues we need to ensure that the channels for supply of contraceptives still remain open during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
lost my slide, sorry. Bash. But
Yes,
also, so I just want, yeah, go on, sorry.
Yes, thank you, Felicity. I quickly want to add that whilst we are discussing the issues of the rise in domestic violence, that there is a silent one at the workplace that we don't usually talk about, and that is sexual harassment and gender-based violence in the workplace, where because of new measures that were instituted in most of our workplaces, that some workers were stuck with supervisors who kept harassing them because they were running a shift system. And with this COVID-19 and the new rationing, and also most importantly, whether termination of appointment or a redundancy is going to go on, who is going to be the victim, or who is going to be put up on the list to go home or either stay in work. So the issue of sexual harassment and gender-based violence in the workplace is also something that we have to look at. And let me also say that Section 63 of the Labor Act categorizes such a termination under unfair termination of employment, because I saw that someone asked that question under sexual harassment. But what do we see? That people even fail to report for fear of being victimized or discriminated against during processes such as redundancies and termination and layoffs.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah, Felicity, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry, yeah, I lost you there. Okay, so I just wanted us to go to gender equity in the health sector. In many countries, including Ghana, women represent the majority of the health and social sector workforce. In this sense, they constitute a key component of frontline defenses and national pandemic response strategies. Is the primary role of women reflected in those who make health-related policy in Ghana? What are some of the risks related to absence of female leadership in such critical response sectors? Are we addressing specific impacts of women and how they interact with the healthcare system? Professor Adumakwam, can you please respond to this one?
Thank you, Felicity. My internet suggests that it's bumpy, so let me know if I sound like I'm chopping off my words. I'm going to be a little bit all over the place in responding to this, because it's not really, you know, we have to look at health within the larger sector of policy responses. In Ghana, our Minister of Health is a male. There are two deputies, one of whom is a female. The director of the Ministry of Health is also male. The chief executive of the Ghana Health Services is also male. Okay, so you know, right at the top, we've got a whole bunch of men. And generally, in a society, you want decision-making, policy-making, understanding and responses to issues to take into account the diversity of our society. So men, women, people with disabilities, the elderly, the young, and so forth. Okay. And if you have groups left out of decision-making, then the likelihood that the issues that confront them will not be addressed increases, because you are leaving decision-making to others. And of course, you have to have representation. You're not going to have 2-year-olds taking decisions on behalf of 2-year-olds. I'm not trying to be, you know, to be reductionist or to be ridiculous. Generally, all over the world, fewer women in policy decision-making at the highest levels. And that also is true for Ghana. Having said that, there are places where policy decision-making occurs, both at the state level, but also in, you know, outside of state spaces. So we've got our Ministry for Gender and Social Protection, who are responsible for a number of issues that relate to gender. And when we talk, we've inserted masculinities onto the table, but we know from a feminist perspective that as much as masculinities are important to study, and it is an area of research that I am very much involved in, we're coming at gender issues from a women's perspective for a very particular historical reason, and the disenfranchisement of women. So there are areas of intervention, for example, that on behalf of women that we expect the Ministry of Gender and Social Protection to highlight. The issue of shelters has been mentioned. It has been 13 years since the law has been passed. We do not have these shelters. We are relying on the ARC Foundation. There's one shelter in the central region, but as far as I'm aware, it's a day shelter. So, you know, it suggests something about successive governments and their commitment to these issues. And you also expect that the Ministry of Gender and Social Protection and the individuals who drive it, and so far all the leadership there have been female, would privilege the situation of women. However, as Japan noted, you don't want to also then, anything that has to do with women is like, okay, women have to solve it. This becomes your problem. It needs to be something that cabinet understands and commits itself to. Moving out of, there's just by way of an example of some other policy spaces, there's a group that is offering advice to the COVID team that responds to the president. It's a membership of about 11, of which 6 are females, highly competent and professional women who are part of this group. So there are also sites of policy that may not be immediately obvious. The COVID response team at the University of Ghana, the researchers that are involved there, you know, policy responses, very much you know, women's involvement there. And then we've got civil society groups like NetRight, for example, the Network for Women's Rights in Ghana, that have been extremely involved in making suggestions and doing their own research and responding. There's a document that NetRight many years ago worked together with the Women's Manifesto Coalition. And this is a very important piece of, I'm going to call it legislation, for one, very loosely, for want of a better word, which governments and other policy makers and even private sector, if they were very serious and minded to, you know, it's like the work has been done for you by the Women's Manifesto Coalition. Take that manifesto, hold on to it, read it, put it into your spirit, and use it to address the many issues that, that concern women. There was something that I wanted to share in terms of, it's not a policy issue, but it speaks to how we want to look at gendered issues when it comes to healthcare and the workforce. One, the data tell us that even though women are not 50% of the healthcare workforce, depending, of course, which layer you're looking at, senior or junior, they are twice as affected in terms of their own health. And generally, but also currently in the COVID environment. That's something I wanted to put on the table. So you're a healthcare worker, but you are not at the level where you are taking decisions. And so it means that both having women's representation, but having, and I think this was stated earlier, having gender sensitive men to understand the gendered ways in which both the sector, but also the disease operates. And then the management of healthcare at the family level. Right? There's a piece of research that I did with a colleague, Dr. Deborah Tubra, that looked at, and this is coming out of her PhD work, but we did some subsequent analysis together, the management of women who had terminal cancer by their spouses. And, you know, you look at data and it really makes you sad, and this is work that we've published. The men want to check out, the men are not, the spouses are generally not interested in, or do not feel capable or competent in dealing with you know, the healthcare issues. The woman's hair has fallen out. She's no more sexual. She's throwing up. It's like, let's transport her to her parents' home and let them deal with that. Or I'll buy you a TV and internet and you can watch Netflix and I've taken care of that. And, you know, I'm just picking on some you know, some areas that resonate for me that were really painful listening to the recordings of the interviews. So to bring masculinities back into the conversation. If we want to have policy that looks at the well-being of women, we have to go back and also look at the ways in which men construct what it is that they think they are responsible for, who they are, what can they do. If I'm cleaning somebody's feces because they are ill, does that make me less of a man? Am I allowed to cry if my mother or my spouse or my child is suffering from an illness? We tend not to, and most of the panelists, if not all, apart from me, are lawyers. We tend not to, and I'm a social scientist, we tend not to look at the fine details of how individual human beings live their lives in particular spaces. I know many of the panelists have referred to some of these issues, particularly issues of disability, issues of stigma. How do we train healthcare workers to look at issues of stigma? We've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence of even some of the healthcare facilities sending people away, insulting or disrespectful behavior to family members, and bringing the perspectives of women into these policy discussions is important because they happen to be the ones who have the experience on the ground in dealing with these issues. So if you don't have conversations with them, if you don't bring them their perspectives and experiences into the designing of policy, you're going to miss all these, these areas of experiences of struggle that people have. And we have talked about disabled people. I'm not sure that we've talked about so much about the elderly. We haven't, I'm not sure that we've talked yet about people who are suffering stigma and the fact that women tend to suffer stigma much more severely. Witchcraft, there's something spiritually unclean about you, much more than men do in terms of the research that we have. Bringing women into the policy spaces is critical. It's extremely critical, and that's a larger decision-making subject for our governments and our policy spaces. Do we want to respond to national issues, local issues in a way that addresses as many of our cross-cutting concerns as possible? If so, we have to bring women to the table. And because there's always this comment that, well, we don't want women just to feel, are you just bringing women because you want women? No, we're bringing women because you want their perspectives. And the excuse that you cannot find women to fill these slots is in 2020 is of course unacceptable because there are so many competent women out there who can fill these slots. Thank you.
Felicity.
Yes, so I think I lost.
So for the sake of time, sorry for intervening. I think, Bashirat, you are next to
It's about 90% of the workforce. What are some of the issues that COVID-19 has made pressing in regard to the health and economic vulnerability of this group? Bashira.
Thank you, Felicity. Quickly, let me react to what Professor Adomako said earlier. I want to say that just by adding on to the lack of representation in the health sector, even when you look at representation in terms of decision-making around the health sector, and you look at the tripartite, like the aspect of the labor movement, it is wholly male-dominated. So if you look at the leadership of the Health Services Workers Union, if there's a meeting, the one who goes is a male. Ghana Registered Nurses Association, that's the only one that the president is female. But otherwise, if you look at Ghana Medical Association and the Association of Lab Technicians in Ghana, it's also male-dominated. Now, what are the fallout of this that we are seeing? What we are seeing is that there was a whole issue and contention about who a frontline worker is to begin with, because most of the workers were cut off, especially the people who are the first point of call when a person goes to the hospital, even without exhibiting the symptoms of COVID-19. So nurses were not even on the list in the initial stages, and they were looking at a certain category of people, and this was a whole issue on its own. There's also the issue to look at about the type of PPEs that were given out. I had 2 nurses complain that It was so bad to an extent that when you are a woman and you are in your period, it quickly stings when something happens, which is also not too good for them working there. And there's also the issue of urination. I mean, how is the difference between a man going to the washroom to urinate and the woman. How favorable and how conducive is the PPE for her to be able to be comfortable so that she doesn't also have to make herself uncomfortable whilst trying to help other people. And there's also the issue of the increasing unpaid care work. What has been the arrangement of the new system of working for these healthcare workers? Like you see people saying that they go to work 2 weeks continuously and then go off 1 week. So what other arrangements are there in emergency cases? Because most of the nurses still complain that the policies do not reflect their needs and that it is still being implemented anyway. So on the issue of the informal economy, let me quickly say that, like we've already mentioned, that women are the majority in that sector, but unfortunately in that sector, they are not covered by the law. So unlike me working in the formal sector, who have access to paid sick leave, who have access to annual leave, who have access to maternity leave, I know that when I go on maternity leave or any of these leaves, I have income security, I'll still be paid. For them, there's nothing like income security. So you are actually on your own. And this is the time for us to actually show women in the informal sector that we do care for them. Because in the 2019 World Economic Forum, the president, Adesina, he said that during the 2008 economic crisis, it is women in the informal economy in Africa who held the economy of Africa together. So this is the time for us to actually show them that we also care and we are ready to help them. Unfortunately, that is not the case. We have left them, and before COVID-19, they had difficulties with access to loans and facilities. They were not getting it. And in this time, how is it going to look like for them when most of them have lost their livelihoods? During the lockdown period, they instituted new measures like rationing and then also shift system, which didn't work too much in some of the markets. Security personnel had to go, some of the women were beaten, their wares destroyed, and so many other things. In places like Kumasi, the major markets, the Kumasi Central Market and the Swami Market, were all closed throughout the period because the arrangements were not working for them. As we speak, they have introduced a card system which was sold to the people at a cost of 3 Ghana cedis, and they have still not even started the process, which is very bad. So if you look at also the health sector, within that sector, they are very vulnerable. Look at how our market is designed, washrooms. And and I have quite a number of times when I go to the market and I try to use a mosque, try to speak to a lot of Muslims, especially the Muslim women, about one, if you go and you want to do ablution, do you know who came to pick up the buta? Do you know who used the washroom? So these are all things that we have to look at in the market. If I go to buy pepper and I've contracted COVID-19, how do you trace me? There's no way you can trace me. One, you have exposed not just the seller of the pepper, but you have exposed every person around her and her family, and it is difficult to do contact tracing and put other measures in place in this. And also the issue about in the informal sector, they are already extremely vulnerable, where people used to go and take the wares and then in the evenings, they go to pay and then they take their profits out. Now, what are we seeing? The person who is a point of contact for you to even get the wares is not there for you to access it. And as we speak, even though normal activities have resumed in some of the markets, the problem has been most market women have been displaced because of the institution of measures like social distancing. So most people have been sacked from where they used to sell. So you go to some of the market areas and then you ask, oh, where are these people? They are no more there because they have instituted social distancing and use those places as the sanitary places where they place the Veronica bucket and other things for people to use. So we have to look at one, income security for them because even workers in the formal sector are not getting living wages. So how much more the informal sector? And one other vulnerable group of people is the domestic workers. These domestic workers, most of them had to be stuck with their employers who were their abusers. And because of the little they were earning, they couldn't leave the job or otherwise. So they were stuck with them during the period of the lockdown. And even now, because work arrangement has totally changed and that schools are still closed. Some of them are stuck with their abusers and their harassers and people who are rapists and other things in their homes. So it's a big issue talking about the informal economy, which is giving us so much remuneration and also stimulus packages. Are we sure that especially women in this sector are going to be able to access these stimulus packages that is there for businesses to benefit from? Thank you.
No, you've had your hand up, so please.
Yes, thank you very much. To emphasize the vulnerabilities of women in the health sector. When you look at the Ghana Labor Force Survey of 2015, women in the health sector constitute 70%. 70%. That means that these 70% are the most exposed to the COVID-19. They are the most exposed and the most vulnerable. What is in place? We just heard Bash talking about the issue of who a frontline worker is and how nurses also had to engage and ensure that they were also covered under the definition of frontline workers. Let's look at even the closure of our borders. We know we get tomatoes from Burkina Faso, we get vegetables from Togo, we get eggs from Cote d'Ivoire, and the market women have to travel outside Ghana within the West Africa sub-region to buy and purchase their wares. What arrangements have been put in place? I do not know what arrangements have been put in place, but these are all issues that we need to address. We talked about the hospitality sector. Women constitute 88.1% of the hospitality center. The Minister of Finance has told us that the hospitality center is one of the hardest hits. So to what extent is the stimulus package addressing this? To what extent do we have social protection safety nets, income support for women in the hospitality sector? We also have even women in the informal sector and an increase in poverty. When we had the lockdown, I was shocked at the numbers of women who even called that they needed money to feed their families and what have you. Now schools have been closed down. Children are at home. The woman has to go to the market to go and sell her wares, or she has to sell wache by the roadside. How does she juggle? Then we have e-learning. One woman told me that she has to buy data. And that is not an expense that she anticipated because she knew she had paid school fees for her daughter in a school in Medina. How is she going to get the resources to buy data so that she can load on for the child? I have one woman who is asking, Auntie Nana Oye, please, can you get me a laptop? She calls me almost every day. Her daughter is in the university and the daughter now has to do distance learning or what have you. She needs money for a laptop. She sells condo in the market. She's not able to raise the money for a laptop. So these are the practical issues and challenges that women in the informal sector face. And we need to adopt a program at the government level for income support and for social protection for women and even both men in the informal sector, but specifically women because they are in the majority in the informal sector. And a third of our households are headed by women. Thank you.
Thank you, Nanoye. So I just want us to go into the question and answer segment of this show today. So I have a question. It says, I want to know the level of implementation of policies, local and international, that protect girls and women. Do we need more policies or intensification of the existing one? So this is a question from Mavis Aye. Who would like to take that question? Bash?
I think that there has been a lot of gaps. I mean, when you look at our system and the policies that are already in place to protect vulnerable people, one, I cited certain provisions in our 1992 Constitution, which is not being implemented or being enforced, should I say. Article 27 One which talks about access to maternity leave, which we know that most employers do not give, especially for those who are in this recruitment agencies and are working on temporary basis. And then there's also the provision of childcare. And as we speak, no government institution even has a childcare facility in place to support women. And if you look at our Labor Act, the provisions in Labor Act 651, 2003, have we been able to enforce what is in it for us to even request for more? Even though there are gaps, like I heard Mamiya talking about a person with disability. Now, our Labor Act does not even cover that aspect, because we as a union movement has even been talking about ratifying ILO Convention 156 that talks about workers with family responsibility. So if you have an autistic child, if your husband is sick, if you are the one responsible for your mom or your father or someone who is sick, a dependent, how are you able to work and then still be able to care for that person? So I think that in this sense, we should ensure that we are doing the most and getting the most out of the existing legislations that we have, because one, there has been enough work to be able to identify the gaps that we have in them and why it is not being enforced. So pushing for one, for us to be able to address these gaps in a very creative and innovative ways whilst we wait for a review or whatever. And then also looking at ratifying relevant international instruments that we can domesticate to extend protection to vulnerable people.
Thank you. And it was what someone wanted to ask that, considering the fact that we can do studies and, sorry, just one second. Aside domestic violence, are we able to objectively collect data to assess the impact of COVID-19 on people with disabilities, for example? What mechanisms currently exist? Professor Adumaku, would you like to answer this one?
Yes, indeed. I was just about to raise my hand and to say that when it comes to research, we tend to put research into boxes. There's hard science and then there's soft science. Hard science deals with genetics, deals with pharmaceutical responses, deals with diagnostics, deals with treatment, deals with large-scale studies to track and to trace, to allow medicines to be designed, looking for a cure, vaccinations, and so on. And we tend to downplay the social sciences and even the humanities. You know, what's happening in the arts sector and how are people affected and so on. And even when it comes to the social sciences, we are interested in surveys, 500 people who can tell us what's the incidence of domestic violence. Okay, so there's a 30% increase in domestic violence. But we are less interested, or we valorize the fine details much less. So yes, there's a 30% increase in domestic violence, and I'm just throwing this number out there. But what's the qualitative change in the kinds of ways in which domestic violence expresses itself? What are the qualitative differences between the ways in which men and women have mentally experienced lockdown or the COVID disease and so on? So because we privilege different types of research findings differently, money is not as available for these qualitative studies. And we need them to understand how to respond to COVID-19 or to any disease. It's one thing to know rates of increase. It's another thing to know who is suffering the most. We may say women more than men, but is it 18-year-old young women? Is it 80-year-old young 80-year-old women? We need that level of understanding of what's going on in our societies, and research tends not to be supported in that way. So this is something that needs to be understood, appreciated. Let's make money available for that kind of research. That's one. Another issue is that when you're looking at research, gender-related research, there's this expectation, understanding, demand that it is women who will do that, predominantly do that kind of research. Okay, and because it tends to get funded less, appreciated less. It drops in the hierarchy, and because women are expected to do it, it drops further in the hierarchy. So there needs to be an appreciation that men also need to do that kind of research. And we need to also privilege and recognize and acknowledge women who are also doing the large scale studies, who are testing and responding to COVID-19. So those are demands that we need to make of our institutions, our universities, our research centers, our government at this time should be investing heavily in that kind of research. And also we need to change the, how can I put it, the color, for want of a better word, of research, so that there's an appreciation that small scale or smaller scale qualitative studies are as important and should be done alongside and together with the large studies, what those of us in the academy will call triangulation. So you're doing your survey, but you're also doing your smaller scale study, actually talking to people to hear what they have to say about their experiences. And because we are insufficiently doing that, we are not getting the full picture. For example, how do we understand many issues that have been raised in this conversation today? We do not have data on, but it will not be as difficult to collect data on how many people have lost their jobs. Okay, but they've lost their jobs, and then what are they doing? Where I live used to be that after 7 p.m. you drive, you see sex workers. For a long time, I was not seeing them. Of course, lockdown was open, I was not seeing them. Recently, I have started seeing 1, 2, 3, and I'm thinking to myself, in this era, first of all, they are not even wearing masks, but of course, even if they wear a mask and they have a client, are they going to have sexual intercourse with a mask on, And I haven't heard anyone talk about sex work, because to solicit is a criminal offense. Being a sex worker is not a criminal offense, but to solicit is a criminal offense. So if you are caught soliciting, you could be arrested. So how then can we even talk about sex work when you are not supposed to be doing sex work? But these are economic realities, and I would very much venture that even women who are not in sex work may now be in sex work or partially in sex work because they are not able to make money in other ways. So I say all this, and this is just one example, that we need the qualitative data to tell us what is happening behind the numbers.
We've also been seeing that the shift to working from home and school closures have been heavily weighted against women, with substantial increases in the unpaid care work. Our policy responses waking up to the significant way in which COVID-19 threatens to displace women from the workforce and impact their career opportunities. Professor Dawuni.
Well, I think I may have to yield it to Mami. I think on the talking point, she was supposed to be responding to this. So Mami, I'll yield to you, and then maybe I can respond afterwards, but if you want me to take it.
Sorry. Could you repeat the question, please? I wanted to.
Okay, we're also seeing that the shift to working from home and school closures have been heavily weighted against women, with substantial increases in the unpaid care work. Our policy response is waking up to the significant way in which COVID-19 threatens to displace women from the workforce and impact their career opportunities.
So the policy responses that we have, I think we've kind of spoken about this in various ways, but we haven't really considered how they've impacted work, because we talked about care work being increased, but how does this relate to, say, career opportunities? Now, in this era, mental health will be a big problem now and post-COVID. because you've got people who don't necessarily share the same space consistently, now having to share that space all the time. You have increased caregiving challenges. And again, from the perspective of a mother of a child with disabilities, if you have a child with autism, there are many children with autism who have, who rely on structure, right? A slight change in their routine could lead to meltdown of epic proportions. If you have to, if they rely on this structure to go to school, come at this time, do X, Y, and Z sequentially, and you change it, you can have a big trouble on your hands. If you have to deal with a child like that consistently, now all the time, every single day, you will have to deal with mental health issues at some point, or have to do physical therapy for the child. You can't catch a break. So part of the things that we have to think about when dealing with the career part is not just that it takes your time, but actually even the mental space for you to do your work and do your work effectively. And one of the things that we have to start thinking about is how to reconceptualize markers of productivity, because companies have, bottom lines, they have, indices where they check how productive you have been. We can't keep those same markers in this era. We've got to reconceptualize them so that they take into account the challenges that people face at home with caregiving and all of this lockdown and post-lockdown impact. In terms of, so we have to put this for mental health. How are your workers doing mentally, particularly the female workers? And mental health issues are not really discussed in this country. It's very taboo. So we are going to have to push that conversation because it is going to be, it is going to come up. And part of the question requires us to look at the scope for innovation. Well, as I've said, mental health now has to become part of our corporate conversation. We tend to separate, we like to, it is related to what Prof. AAA said, we like to categorize things, very discrete elements. So gender is a specific issue, even in law. Gender is a specific area, disability is a specific area. We have to start thinking intersectionally now, because everything that we do will have ripple effects. Externalities have to be thought through when we are doing legislation. So if you're thinking in terms of career opportunities, for example, we've already said that many women occupy the lower levels, and there's research showing that women tend to occupy sales or lower level jobs, right? These jobs are now going to be taken over by computers because people are working from home, people are using technology. How are women in STEM now has to be, far more important than we have ever, dealt with in the past. Because if you don't have technology, then you will be phased out of the workforce pretty soon, because people are going to rely far more on technology now than they ever did before. So where are women in that educational side? If we are dealing with, lockdown, yesterday I went to Legon campus and I thought to myself, COVID has done what Professor Tego couldn't do, close out the night market at 10 o'clock, because there was nobody there. Now, I think even if we did a random check, we'd find that more women sell there than men. So closing, the night market that supplies Legon, and mostly the students with food and whatever, is closed at very odd hours. So an educational policy will have a ripple effect financially, will have a ripple effect in other areas. We need to start thinking about that, the issues that arise from intersections, rather than thinking of them as discrete elements. Think about paid care work. Care work is not, even globally, it's not really paid. In Ghana, nobody really considers care work as, but there are ways to think about how do we pay caregivers? Because if you're not paid, it will affect your ability to get pension, for example, because your pension depends on your pay. How you get insurance, access to insurance, all depends on, so we have all of these intersecting challenges that we now have to start thinking about. So care work, we now start costing care work. In other countries, I've seen articles about an increased rate of divorce, which also comes with issues of custody. Property rights are big issues when it comes to marital property and in divorce situations. Now, if caregiving is considered, and these days the courts are considering caregiving as part of what we would think about as contribution for rights of access of a spouse to property rights. How are we going to, what is the value of caregiving in COVID times when it's an increased burden? That's something that the law has to start thinking about, because they're not the same levels of caregiving that we've had before. Should that carry more weight, for example, in a litigation over marital property? Or should we start thinking about other ways in which we arrive at the answer of who gets what property? And then the final area in terms of innovation about law, in which we're thinking about these areas, is taxation. Now, in the Ghanaian law on taxation right now, only one person can claim reliefs that perhaps the couple may share. So we have reliefs for caregiving. If you have up to 3 children, you get X amount of money as a relief so that you get some money back. But only one of the people in that couple can claim it. So if you have more women, and again, particularly in terms of disability, more women than men deal with the care and the cost of children with disabilities. Now, if that is so, then you have more women who need that tax relief than men do. But if you have the women in the informal sector, how are they going to claim tax reliefs? How are we going to get back any of that money that we have spent on that child? So we need to start rethinking even our taxation so that you can claim back some of that money that you have spent, because the burden is disproportionately on women who have to pay for that thing. And we give tax reliefs for education, but the law is specific. It says when your child is registered at a recognized educational institute. And I've argued in articles before that that concept of education must change, because if you have a child with disabilities, what you will think as education, for some children, depending on the level of disability, even even being able to tie your shoe is a form of education for that, shoelaces, is a form of education for that child. We need to start reconceptualizing things and thinking about how the law relates to different, how the things are intersecting, because otherwise we will keep passing. So this can also answer the question about, should we create more laws and more legislation and whatever? We will just keep passing laws that will still have gaps, because we are dealing with discrete sections rather than dealing with them as overlaps and intersections. And I think that going forward, and COVID has really brought out the gaps in legislation, this is how we have to think, because you can't pass a law on, you can't create stimulus packages without thinking about, for example, how will KIA benefit from stimulus packages? How will it trickle down to the, to the really, to the bottom? Prof. AAA talked about sex workers. We are in this country, we are afraid to mention other sexual proclivities, sexual identities don't come up at all when we are talking about these things, but they should. And so our laws must start to we have to start rethinking, and this from research perspectives all the way into practice and policy makers. We need to start to reconceptualize the way we view law and the way we view society and how it interacts with, we interact with each other, so that we can have more robust legislation that actually feeds the needs of the people.
Okay, thank you so much, Mamiya. Farah, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I want to commend you for this program. First, I want to add my voice to what Professor Josephine Dawuni said about men being part of the panel, because if we really want to have balanced views or appreciate the extent of the situation, we need to have men on board as well. I have 4 questions actually, but my first question has been touched on by Professor AA and Mami Yamensa. It's about the most vulnerable people in the community, taking into consideration KIAs and are ladies of the night. What other ways can government and other stakeholders help alleviate the economic impact on these women post-COVID? Because we know that after COVID, there should be regulations or policies that will help KIAs and ladies of, when I say ladies of the night, I hope we all know who these people.
Oh, just mention sex workers, please.
Just mention
okay.
Just mention sex workers.
Okay, it is an industry, but I think we are failing to address this group of people.
So you are contributing to the problem by not naming it. So it will be important for you to name it. Yes.
Oh, that's quite interesting. Okay. So, sex workers, what other ways can government and stakeholders help alleviate the economic impact and other impacts of these people post-COVID? My second question has got to do with technology, gender and technology. What regulations are being put in place to protect the jobs of women who are technologically deficient? Because we know that technology has come to solve a lot of problems during this COVID era, and most women are, unable to have access to technological tools like computers and all that. Some people are being laid off because the work they could have done in person, they have to do it technologically, but they don't have the expertise, and so they are being laid off. What policies or what regulations are being put in place to protect these women? And also, what can women do to take advantage of the technological space that is here now? Sorry, let me quickly
Vera, there wouldn't be enough time for them to answer your questions if you've asked 3 questions, and they all need to have a take. Thank you so much for your question.
So Felicity, let me, oh, sorry.
No, please.
Okay, let me make it quick. To your question about what should government do to help women in these different categories that you mentioned, I'll link it to Bashira's first point. She made, saying that the legal frameworks exist in most cases, right? We know that they do have loopholes. So it could be an issue of changing them, plugging the loopholes, and maybe in some cases just totally bringing up something new. That is true. I agree with that. But I also want us to remember that we need to politicize these issues. When we have elections coming up, we need to have these politicians put this on their agenda and hold them accountable to it when they come into office. So that is very important in terms of how we can make sure that existing laws, even if they are inadequate and have gaps, do have some impact until we revise them somehow. On the issue of technology, I want to also say, coming at it from a micro level, most of these things we're talking about, we're looking at it from the policy making level. That means that, once again, government. We need to reconstitute what our understanding of government is. Government is us. You and I, as citizens, are part of the government. And so in as much as those elected to represent us have a responsibility to respond to us, we also have a duty to hold them accountable. How do we do all of this? We have to remember that we are part of the solution. And so the example of how do we look at the workforce reconfiguration and women losing out? When you go to the market, most of us have our favorite market women. I've talked to them. How can you use your cell phone and WhatsApp to engage in marketing from your home that you don't necessarily have to come to the workplace? I read a story of a woman in Benin, who's the market woman. And she has used her WhatsApp to connect with her customers so she can deliver products to them. Now, I know that it may be an issue of cost in terms of all that, but we also have to be part of the conversation, dealing with women, whether they are women of sex workers, whatever categories you're looking at, and see how we can be part of the re-education process, that we are doing our part from the grassroots level. We are asking governments to do it from the macro level. And in that way, we are having an impact, and hopefully there will be a place where we meet and then things work out. So we shouldn't just leave it to government, by which we define government to be the policymakers alone. They have a responsibility. We have a responsibility as well.
If I can come in with the sex workers, like I said, it's an industry, and we have had government intervention, but purely from a public health perspective. So the Ghana AIDS Commission, WAPCAS, and other organizations help, basically to ensure that they are protected, basically to ensure that we don't get the HIV transmission and all that. So there are some government institutions working to protect, especially the reproductive health and rights of sex workers, and also address their needs, because maybe a decade or so ago, they were one of the main drivers for HIV. So there is a relationship. And also, I know that the Ghana Police Service, there is also a program where they're made to understand some of the dynamics, and also they are supported to also help in terms of violations against the rights of commercial sex workers. With the Kaya also, this is an area where it's a development issue, is an economic issue, is a social, and also a cultural issue. And across board, governments have sought to support Kayas, and there are several programs in place to help, especially from the social protection angle. So they have been given free national health insurance cards so that they're able to access health. When I was the minister, we actually opened 2 centers at Malamata Market and Agbogloshi Market so that they could receive some form of services, educational, and then also to address gender-based violence. And then there was also the program so that those who wanted to go back to their homes to the north would be given some skills so that they could also do trading or whatever they wanted to do. So there are some programs in place, but there'll be a need for us to coordinate, and there'll be a need for us to optimize to make sure that they're actually benefiting the vulnerable groups, especially in this time of COVID. We also, what happened during the lockdown, where some of the Kayas tried to go back home, and then they were caught up, I think, in the Ashanti region or where, and then there was chief executive who sought to bring them down. They came down to Accra. They didn't have anywhere to live, and government had to step in, and all the challenges that came in. So we need to have a coordinated, effective approach to addressing this otherwise development issue of Kaya. The same goes to market women. Bash has spoken about some of the challenges. Yes.
Thank you, Nanoye. Professor Adumako, please come in.
Thank you. I was preparing to respond to Mamea, who did a very good job of linking law and social issues. And because I want to believe that policymakers and our government are listening to this program, or people will repeat it to them, I'd like to add to the shopping list of issues that have been raised, and especially to encourage our government to start thinking in the long term. I think that COVID has raised a number of issues globally for all of us and for governments who suddenly have to recognize that you need to think outside these 4, 8, 5, 10 year spaces and plan for the long term. Ghana, we are doing national identification, and so this provides us with a very good opportunity to upscale our social protection. We need to think about more, allow me to use the word, more serious ways of providing for the most vulnerable. Our cash handouts really do not do very much. So now we know that we've got Kaya, we've got market women, we've got those who provide agricultural services and on, who have been disenfranchised. Some are working, some are part-time working, some are paid domestic workers who've lost their jobs, and so on. It shouldn't be so difficult to identify such groups. Cash handouts, something that we can do. Home care workers, mothers, grandmothers, aunties, there are some services that can be provided to them to alleviate the struggles of doing this unpaid care work. For example, providing water. Government has said, certain utilities, they are giving us what's the word? We've got some reprieve. But if you never had water coming through your tap, or electricity coming through the wires in your home, or you didn't even have wires, then it doesn't help you that it's free. So we know some of these communities where there's a challenge. Let's take water tankers into these communities and enable people to have water. Check on people's well-being, both in the workplace and at home. Unfortunately, we do not have enough counselors, enough social workers, enough clinical psychologists to do this, but we need to start from somewhere. And in terms of thinking for the long term, we should recognize now, and somebody mentioned, I think it was Mamiya, or maybe it was one of the callers, that mental health is, the WHO says it's the fastest growing disease anyway. So before COVID, mental health issues were climbing. COVID has come to add to that, because it's stigmatized, and unless you're walking around the city naked, nobody thinks you have mental health issues. I think I'm struggling with mental health issues right now because I'm overwhelmed with work, taking care of myself, family members, of course, they're also taking care of me, my students, my co-workers, and so on, and it doesn't end. So we can take these services into the workplaces, into the communities. Another thing that I would like us to think of long-term is education. Again, masculinities has been mentioned, but if you look at some of our social science textbooks, I mean, my own daughters now are in their 20s, and I look at some of the social science books being used in JSS, and it's the same thing that they have. Mommy in the kitchen cooking rice water, father in the sitting room reading newspaper, kind of thing. I mean, really seriously, we are still regurgitating that kind of stuff for our children. This is the opportunity to bring COVID, other social issues into the classroom in very real ways. And we are doing more and more online teaching, so we can create these products and make them recyclable for our students to visit. These kinds of, there are so many panels going on online. They are being recorded, they are being archived. Let's share them for our students, JSS, SSS. Even some of them that I have seen, one or two, are simple enough for upper primary students and their teachers, of course, to understand. The last comment I would like to suggest onto this shopping list has to do with IT. We can provide very simple phones for vulnerable people. And we can even pre-load certain information on it for them, counseling services that you could call, credit that you could access, and so forth. They are amazing young people out there who can provide apps, and they would probably be very happy to do it for free or for a very little amount of money. They get the experience, they get the platform to say that they created this app, and you hand it out to people for free. They are definitely business leaders who would support ventures. And since at the moment we are not playing football, maybe people who support football can put some of their money into those kinds of ventures. Thank you.
Thank you. Bash, we're nearly running out of time, so can you give us your final words? Probably 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Felicity. I wanted to add to the discussion around the type of new jobs that are coming up post-COVID. Looking at people working from home, and especially women, and the implications on women losing jobs. And this is also affecting men anyway. So my interest was that we have to look at which sectors are women in the majority when we are talking about job losses, and how can we protect women in those sectors. And the second one is, I heard us talking about, well, technology can be a deficiency, and because of that, there could be termination or redundancies or whatever. But the truth of the matter is that there is protection for workers in terms of the introduction of new technologies or new equipment at the workplace. So if you are my employer and you are introducing a new form of work, how work should be conducted. Section 9 of the Labor Act talks about the duty of an employer to train and retrain a worker to be able to work. So if you feel that the work I'm doing because of COVID-19 or any other issue, I have to work from home, I have to use a computer, I have to be able to use Excel. It is your duty as an employer to train me to be able to do that. And this is also reiterated again under the right of a worker, Section 10 in the Labor Act, that a worker has the right to be trained and retrained. So we have to keep talking about this so that employers do not use this as an excuse to push certain categories of workers out of the labor market. Now, this type of employment has been on increase even before COVID-19. You see, when they categorize it under ghost employment or invisible employment, and it has been on the increase where companies were outsourcing most of their activities to individuals outside. Some of them, they've never met a company before. Some of them, it was through recruitment agencies. Other, it was through internet that they gave the work for them to do, and then they'll pay you via the same processes. How can we extend protection to these categories of people and ensure that we, as a civil society group or as a trade union, train and prepare workers in this sector for any unforeseen circumstances, i.e. whether you are losing your job, whether the person you are even working for is cheating you or exploiting your labor in any way. Finally, I would like to say that we have all seen how COVID-19 does not discriminate. I mean, it hits anyone. I read in the news yesterday how the Greater Accra Metropolitan Assembly buried a 9-year-old as part of the 16 corpses that they had to bury, and it's unfortunate. So COVID-19 is a leveler. It doesn't know an old person, doesn't know a rich person, but unfortunately, our justice system and our practices discriminate against us. So we should be able to ensure that all these practices, what we do and what the law says and the justice system should not discriminate against anybody, so that on the pedestal, everyone is equal and are treated equally, so that we can also contribute to reducing the level of inequalities, which has been further entrenched during this time of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Bash. Mamia, your final words, please.
So as with everything, I will state from the perspective of intersectionality as the way forward, because dealing with the economy has been really finance oriented only, exclusively, I mean, and without thinking about the ripple effects in other spaces. So policymakers, and in fact, all of society actually, we need to start to think about how we deal with the overlaps in spaces. As an academic, academics need to start thinking about these overlaps. You know, there shouldn't be, there's this gender activists and this person activists. There are so many ways in which we can marry our research. Gender and disability have so many things in common, gender and finance, gender and tax. So that even from a research perspective, there's so many ways in which we can show that we can create a more cohesive research backdrop for policies to be more robust, to be more relevant to the needs. So COVID-19 is giving us not just exposing weaknesses or showing gaps, but also providing opportunities for different ways of thinking about research, about policy, about legislation. And we should take this opportunity right now to do that, so that for future pandemics, hopefully we can avoid some of the mistakes we've made with this one.
Thank you so much. So today's panel marks the end of the first edition of the Law in Crisis series. The University of Ghana School of Law team is currently preparing the second edition of the Law in Crisis series, which will also feature a series of 7 panels dealing with law and policy, dealing with law and policy issues that have been made urgent by the pandemic. On behalf of the Dean of the School of Law and the conveners of the series, I would like to thank you for your support. We have had over 30,000 people joining us live, streaming the sessions and interacting with the various discussions. We very much appreciate the support and enthusiasm for these conversations. During the break, before the Law in Crisis series returns for a second edition, the School of Law will be analyzing the data gathered in order to develop detailed policy briefs and recommendations for action. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for having